Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today I have a really thought-provoking interview with Laurin Conlin, owner and head coach of Team LoCoFit, an online fitness coaching company. She's an IFBB Pro Bikini competitor. She earned her Bachelor of Science from Florida State University and her Master's of Science from the University of South Florida, both in exercise science. And she continues to serve as a research assistant to Dr. Bill Campbell's Physique Enhancement lab at USF. For her master's thesis, Laurin conducted a really interesting study in resistance-trained individuals and the differences between adopting a macronutrient-based flexible diet versus a rigid meal plan on fat loss. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss today. So without further ado, let's get straight into the interview. Hey, Laurin, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate you making time for me. So now, before we get started with the topic for today, which is on nutrition, and it's going to be flexible versus rigid restraint when dieting, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience and explain who you are, what you do, and why you're so awesome at it.
Well, that was a real big hype up for this morning, so I appreciate that. So I actually did research on this topic for my master's, which we'll get into. So I'm super excited to talk about this as one of my favorite topics. But a little bit about me. So I have been a nutrition and coach for almost 10 years now. I have been a NPC and IFBB competitor, so done figure and bikini over the years, and then clearly the figure was the amateur part. So yeah, no longer do I have a figure physique. When I first started, I was like, you have all these visions like, oh, I'm gonna do figure, I'm gonna be so jacked, and then I was like, wait, this is not working out as anticipated. So so I competed for many years. And like I said, I started coaching almost 10 years ago. I have my bachelor's in exercise science, my master's as well, but my master's research did focus primarily on dieting interventions and mindset. So that's really what we focus on now. Mostly, I would say, is the nutrition and the mindset component for clients, because it really is the missing piece in my experience. And that's regardless of the client's goal. We work with lifestyle clients, new moms, top level physique competitors, performance athletes. So it doesn't really matter what type of client we're working with. Most people, the thread that kind of ties that together is blending nutrition and their mindset to create these habits and lifelong sustainability. So yeah, and then I have a podcast as well. So it's called the LoCoFit Show. So we put out a new episode every week. I do some writing, I do some speaking. So kind of just a whole mishmash of things.
Yeah, I mean, I find it very common in the fitness industry that we all wear different kinds of hats trying to help people in as many ways as we possibly can, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there's many different ways to do it, which is great. And I'm somebody who enjoys doing different things all the time. So
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for the introduction. So, to get all the listeners up to speed, shall we start with definitions then? Let's define what is rigid restraint and what flexible restraint is, on the other hand, if that's all right with you.
yeah, so typically when people think of restraint, we think of it being like one concept. But what was interesting was when I first started to dive into this literature, kind of more of like the eating behavior type literature, it was shown as two different constructs, basically flexible restraint and rigid restraint. And rigid restraint is what most people would typically would categorize as maybe they might think of restraint, right? Very black and white thinking, off and on thinking, and putting food in the context of food, putting things off limits. not really being able to moderate yourself, being very impulsive around food. And that's actually one of the things that I've seen as a key hallmark to rigid restraint is being very impulsive with choices. Whereas flexible restraint is this more moderate approach, right? You're obviously moderating yourself. You're able to incorporate different types of foods. You're able to pre-plan and be less impulsive. So when someone has an event coming up, they are able to moderate themselves to say, okay, I know that I'm going to be having this dinner later. Why don't I eat a little bit less and moderate myself earlier in the day, or make different choices, or make sure that I am, practicing restraint the next day, instead of somebody who maybe is practicing more rigid restraint might say, oh, I have this event. Well, whatever. I already overate this event. I'm going to come home. I'm going to eat a lot more. Then the next day, who knows what that's going to look like. And then I'm going to do extra cardio because now I feel guilty and I'm on this cycle of compensatory behaviors. So it's very, very common. And in that literature, there wasn't a lot necessarily on people who are doing what we're doing, right? So I was kind of like pulling all these different things because at this point I was coming up with the study design. It was 2014. So that's kind of like the IFYM like heyday, right? When everything was getting crazy and starting. So I was like, oh, it's flexible restraint, flexible dieting, which we can get into. It's not. But that's really where all of this started. And I was like, oh, this is a really unique way of looking at it. And it's pretty much changed how we view, coaching individuals since then.
I find it really interesting that you pointed out the impulsivity that comes with rigid restraint, because I found the same. I found the same to be true in my own experience and my own
Hmm.
practice. When somebody has a very rigid approach to dieting or fitness in general, they
Hmm.
seem to develop such a strong sense of urgency in normally eating situations where it
Hmm.
seems like you can easily they're basically telling themselves, this is the one and only opportunity I have to eat this, so I need to make the most of it. And it's almost
Hmm.
like they try to do it as fast as possible before they remember, well, I'm supposed to be on a diet, so I should avoid this food.
Hmm.
Whereas I found that when I teach my clients the concept of being more flexible and that they can achieve their goals with more flexibility, they become so much more chill, and they will tell me, hey, I used to struggle so much with insert any food, and now I just had a piece of it and I was fine.
Hmm. Yeah, and the impulsivity is a really, really interesting concept, and I see that come up a lot. And that really kind of tends to be this hallmark, and that can be, like you said, for a meal. It can be a certain type of food. It can be just in general, like goals, right? Like, oh my gosh, I want to do this right now. I got it 180. Like, let's do this now. And it's like, whoa, 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 like where did this come from? Or let's take all these things into account. And I'm all about being like diligent and like making a change. But there is a difference. And that's actually like there's this paradox of when you are very rigid, you typically are not actually even seeing the results that you want to because you're going through this kind of yo yo cyclical pattern. Because the methods that most people are using when they are very rigid are not sustainable. And that word gets thrown around a lot, right? And I think when people think sustainable, that means, oh, just don't track your food at all. Like, don't, no, that's not, not what we're talking about. There's a lot of different ways that we can blend these things, and it really should be looked at on a continuum. But, anyways, that's a long winded answer. That's flexible and rigid restraint. But it really can be a lens that you can use just for clients in general, not just food, right? I mean, it is in this
Mhm.
context, we're talking about food, but just in general, kind of moderating practices and behaviors that people are doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for that explanation. That was fantastic, very, very exhaustive, and also simple to understand for everyone, I'm sure. So that leads into, you actually already referenced a research paper that I wanted to talk to you about today, which is your research paper. It's titled Flexible versus Rigid Dieting in Resistance Trained Individuals Seeking to Optimize Their Physiques, a randomized controlled trial. And it came out in 2021, if I'm not wrong.
Hmm.
So, my
Hmm.
first question on that, clearly you care so much about this topic that you delved into it with your own research. And my
Hmm.
understanding is that when somebody conducts a study, their purpose is to try and answer a question, or at least, if not in full, because one study can possibly normally answer a question in full, at least
Hmm.
contribute something to the puzzle.
Hmm.
And so I want to
Yeah.
know, what is the question that you wanted to answer, and why was it so important to you that you decided to dedicate your master's thesis, if I'm not wrong,
Mhm.
to it?
Yeah. Yeah, so like I mentioned, this was in 2014. So kind of to paint the backstory, this was when the industry was very much making this big shift of IFYM, especially when we're talking about physique competitors, right? And at this point, I had started competing. I had started competing in 2011, and then had heavily competed in 2013. Just finished out my undergrad, just started grad school, and I'm like all into like flexible dieting, competing, like all this stuff. But what I was starting to see was at that time, we were seeing a lot of backlash from the very rigid meal plans. We were seeing a lot of backlash from clients who didn't have any support after a show from their coaches. Weight regain after a diet is so prevalent. So I pretty much was like, why don't like can we just look at flexible diet, like tracking macros versus a meal plan and see what happens during a diet and afterwards? Like, I was really interested in the after period, but I was just genuinely, is there a difference between these two interventions, either during a diet or after? So that was really the kind of starting point, right, of everything. And that's why, like, a lot what was published here is obviously the much more condensed version. But when you're in the master's program, you have to write all the different, the background stuff. And I was pulling from all different types. I was pulling from like the weight regain literature. I was pulling from the eating, behaviors literature, and just trying to like put these different things in and say like, we don't really, I don't really know where this is coming from, but this is what we're seeing kind of in the real world. So like, let's run a study. And to be fair, no study is ever going to be able to conduct exactly what we want, right? Like I wasn't going to be able to put people on a 5 list meal plan and diet them so aggressively for 6 months and then watch them like rebound. You know what I mean? Like that's not going to be a possibility.
Hmm.
So first of all, the IRB would not approve that. Um, first and foremost. Secondly, it's just not realistic. I mean, my study already was crazy long. It was 22 weeks total, which is pretty much unheard of for most research, just because it's really hard to get people to stick around for any kind of intervention based research. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so that was the main question. Like, hey, is there a difference between these two things with a fat loss phase and a what we were calling the post diet phase or a weight regain phase? So technically, they were allowed to do anything. I didn't give any I didn't want to give anything for that. The design was do whatever you want afterwards, but just come back for the follow up testing. So some
Okay.
people, theoretically could have continued to diet or they could have rebounded if they wanted to. But the goal wasn't that. It was just to see what happens afterwards.
Okay. And just to clarify, I think you've implied it, but just for the listeners who might not be familiar, your participants were resistance trained, but they didn't have obesity, so they were
No.
people that were considered a quote unquote normal weight for their
Hmm.
size based on
Hmm.
the BMI, right?
Yes, so they were normal size. They were resistance trained. Now, the qualifications were about a year of resistance training. So I wouldn't say, and again, in research, that's already hard enough, right? But it wasn't like we were taking a pool of like the study design idea came from a pool of what we were seeing with physique clients, and then we said, okay, how can we best replicate this
Hmm.
so we had people who were consistently training. And then also, yes, to your point, within a normal weight range, which was, part of the IRB is them being like, well, why are you dieting normal weight people? It's like, listen, like,
Okay.
like it's just what we're doing. And not everybody, some people were higher, obviously higher and lower. But and we did not control training because that would have been another variable, right? To
Hmm.
that would have been a change. So the idea was, hey, continue with your same type and style of training and cardio. The only difference now is the diet intervention. Because if we had controlled training, then we would know exactly what was going on with training, which would have been great. But then that would have been a big change for some people. That would have been much harder for certain clients or certain, sorry, participants, and that would have been much easier for other participants. So there's always like, oh, should we have done this? And it was probably better actually that we didn't. And at that point, in the lab, it was not feasible. So
That makes sense. So the original idea came to you because we didn't say it, but the LoCoFit podcast exists because you actually have a coaching company yourself. You're not just a
Yes.
coach on your own, and it's called the Team LoCoFit,
Hmm.
correct?
Yes.
And so
Yep.
I'm what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at the time it seems like I don't know if you were still a competitor yourself, but you coached clients who were competitors, and you
Hmm.
were seeing that they were really struggling with weight regain post show,
Hmm.
and that was affected by their flexible or less flexible
Hmm.
restraint, degree of restraint. And so you wanted to fill this gap in the literature to try to help
Hmm.
yourself coach these people to avoid these problems post show, correct?
Correct. Yeah. To a large degree, I was realizing that, weight loss is generally not the problem. I mean, part of, not saying that weight loss is easy, but what happens afterwards is
Mm-hmm.
much harder to maintain. And obviously, when I'm talking about a physique competitor, we're not trying to maintain their competition physique, but we don't also need to rebound, right? And
Yes.
then for the lifestyle client, the whole point of going on a fat loss phase is to actually maintain that fat loss, right? So it's like all
Yes.
of these things, I didn't know exactly who was going to serve at the time, but I knew that this was incredibly important because I was seeing a lot of these issues. And at the time, we were just seeing, okay, well, it's the meal plan, right? Is it the meal plan, so to speak? And I'm doing air quotes for anybody who's just listening, so I'm just a really awkward answer. Um, Meal plans. So that was what seemed to be driving a lot of this, right? Was the low food flexibility or low option of food, and the very much well, typically most of the meal plans were also not only low food variety, but just really, really low calorie. I mean, the stuff that we were seeing was pretty rough back then, with a lot of the teams circulating these meal plans. But I've come to realize that it wasn't the meal plan. It wasn't the meal plan. Now, the meal plans that we were giving had more options, right? Because again, think about people joining the study. They are going to be like, "Yo, what is this? I'm not eating tilapia every day for every meal." Like that, I wouldn't want to do that anyway. But so our meal plan did have some options, right? It was a well balanced meal plan, but it still was a set meal plan. So what I found though is that it wasn't necessarily that. It was really really useful for certain people. So I don't think that meal plans are the issue, so to speak. It more so goes back to that mindset of flexible versus rigid restraint, which I back then incorrectly thought had to do with the diet, and it's not the diet. You can apply that mindset to any diet. You can apply a flexible mindset to a meal plan. People would say, well, how are you going to do that? Of course, the foods are already chosen, but kind of there is some flexibility involved in terms of, okay, do I need to make some substitutions? What times and all those types of things. So it's more of a stretch there, obviously. So it is much more rigid. However, the mindset behind things, like you can be just as rigid tracking macros.
Hmm.
And that's actually, I'm really glad we didn't publish it when I graduated because I would not have had that knowledge or information. And we were able to very concisely share that in the paper, um, that, flexible restraint is not necessarily flexible dieting or IFIM. So,
That's that. I really like that you said that. I've been thinking about this a lot recently, but it's been one of my thought threads for several years now. How in the fitness industry, I see tools being demonized, and in the end, different ways of dieting. So IFYM or rigid meal plans, counting your calories, losing weight without counting your calories. These are all just tools. But then there will be polarizing views of these tools that, in my opinion, miss the bigger picture, which is what you're saying. Tools are just tools. They're not good or
mhm,
bad. It's how you use them that really can affect your degree of success and also how they impact your life, because
mhm,
somebody could be, as you said, extremely flexible with a meal plan and see the diet through to the end and be really happy afterwards and be able to maintain. And for somebody else, you give them a meal plan, they stay on it for 2 days, and then 2 days later they're eating everything that's in their pantry because they feel fat deprived. So I
Mhm.
thought that it was really cool that you essentially agree with my view, which is that we're missing the forest for the trees, as they say, if we demonize the tool for the sake of social media traction rather than helping people with their mindsets. And in case, since
Ugh.
nobody else can see you, I just want to say to the audience that Laurin just did an amazing eye roll that I loved just now.
Yes, I do those a lot, especially when it comes to, social media things, and you nailed it. People do this for traction, and it's so frustrating because there's so much arguing about tools and methods, and there is a range of what I would consider to be optimal practices, right? There's certain things that are foundational to every client. Like, hey, we should all be working towards these types of things for most people. The very like the other, 20 or 30% is where things are going to differ. And that's okay. Like, it's totally okay if somebody is going to respond better to a certain type of plan, and maybe they only do that for a certain period of time and then they move on, right? Like, I used to be one of those people. I used to be very like, no, this is the best way, this is the right way. And I think that, to your point, you've been thinking about this for a few years. I think that the more that you coach people, the more that you realize that there is so much that will work. It's going to, but what works is going to depend on the individual and their time and space. You know what I mean? Like, what is going on in their life. And that's what coaching is, right? And there's a difference between, hey, having a program and, an app, and then also having one on one coaching. And those things should be separate, And I
Mhm.
think that for a lot of people getting started, a lot of basic fundamental things can work different ways. And we shouldn't be demonizing, to your point, those things, because then people are so confused and they're like, well, now, like, what should I be? Should I not be doing this? Should I be doing this? And there's already so much confusion in general, So it's like,
Mhm.
hey, let's all just like work together and just say, like, if we're trying to help people, like, there's a bunch of different ways that we can do it.
Exactly. And I feel like creating confusion and fear disempowers people because again,
Overtime.
not understanding what might be right or what might not be right, or being afraid of trying certain tools takes choice away from the individual. And ultimately, the less choice you have, the higher the chance that the method you're left with you have a 50-50 chance at that point if there's only one choice left, because every other choice is bad. It either
Yeah.
works for you or it doesn't, and if it doesn't work, then what do you do?
Yeah. And you're like, oh, this isn't for me. It's like, no, it is for you. There's just certain things that are going to work better for certain individuals. I have some
Exactly.
people who we have some clients who track macros, all three macros, and they're very, very successful. We have some clients who do protein and calories. We have some clients who just do habits. And then we have some clients who do all three. They kind of go in between them. And that's like,
Exactly.
that's really where the ultimate goal is, in my opinion, is to be able to go through that arc of like, all right, let's develop these foundations, then let's get into tracking, and then we can kind of ease out of this and go back and forth between whatever that we need in that period. And it's all about regulating, and that's where that restraint comes in. So people hear the word flexible, and then that whole other, so there's like two spectrums that I feel like I'm always fighting against. It's either the people who are like, no, like, you need to be like super, super rigid and dialed in with 100%. Mind you, that's typically the people who are not going to be able to like have any moderation, right? So they're going to be like in this cyclical pattern. Or then it's like, no, just don't do anything. Just kind of eat however you want. Like, it's totally like, whoa, why did we go in between these two things? Like, we have to have, that's why I love the word flexible restraint. There is flexibility and there's restraint. You don't just get to eat whatever you want if you want to have optimal health and functioning and digestion and physique and performance. Like, it's just not going to work. Like, 99.999% of people are going to have to display some type of restraint with their diet. There's always like the one crazy person, but it's very rare. You're going to have to display some restraint with your diet. But you also need to have a flexible mindset on top of that. So it's not just one or the other. It truly is a marriage of both of them.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that's exactly what was on my mind as I was reading your paper and as I wanted to interview you. So, great point there. I completely agree. Now, circling
Yay.
back to your study, which sounds like really contributed to the way you view this topic now and how you coach people. So I'd like to delve a bit more into the methods. So what kind of diets what kind the participants, we talked about them, but let's talk about how exactly you laid out the diets for them so that
Mhm.
the listeners are aware.
Yeah, so what we did was there was a baseline period where we were going through and just, getting all of the baseline information from people. And then we were gathering their 3-day food logs at that point. That was the method that we were using. So 3-day food logs, also getting their RMR. So essentially based off of those two things, we would take a, calorie reduction percentage from that. So it worked out to be around 20% for most people,
So
if we were
just as a
doing it off
quick
of.
interjection, RMR
Yeah.
stands for resting metabolic rate.
Yes.
So you were
Um,
trying to calculate their maintenance calories and their deficit from those maintenance calories.
yes. So we were looking at two methods. We were saying, okay, we're going to measure their RMR, which
Okay.
would be their, basic calories burned at rest times an activity factor. And
Hmm.
then we're also going to look at their food log. And if there was a mismatch, like typically most people's food log will be higher. So
Yeah.
that we would take a 25% reduction from that. But if
Oh, I
their food
see.
log was mismatched, right, meaning that their RMR times their activity factor was lower or higher, sorry, than their food log, we would take 15% off of their RMR, and that would be
Oh,
their
okay.
so that's where the around 20% comes from. Um, because for most of those people, like not everybody had a great experience tracking. And again, at the time, we had the ability to do a 3-day food log. Now, Dr. Campbell's lab does. Typically, they have like people who are like nutrition coaches. They help you with like tracking. They do a whole week. Like it's so much more advanced now, which is really rad. They have a whole team of people. So it was just us. um, so it was me, him, and then actually one of my coaches now, Danielle. She was my assistant. So it was just us. So that was like what we had. So that was our baseline period, and we were testing body weight, body fat, RMR. At baseline, we did a psychological eating behaviors questionnaire, and then we also did salivary leptin, which showed nothing, so we're not even gonna talk about it. So that was a waste
Cool.
of money. And so that was the baseline period. Then after we calculated all that, we put people on this deficit, and then it was randomized to either the meal plan group or the macro group. So because of the nature of research, you can't bias it, you can't coach people. So obviously we knew that there was going to be some struggles, but again, that's just going to be kind of the reality of the situation at that point. So with the macros, we did give them a how to track macros ebook, in terms of like, hey, because we can't like coach you. So like here, if you've never tracked macros before, here's some assistance. Obviously, the meal plan is pretty straightforward. So people did that for 10 weeks. We did, like I said, a baseline testing, a mid testing, so 5 weeks, and then at the end of the diet at the 10 weeks. And then at the end of those 10 weeks, we said, do whatever you want, but please come back at week 15 and week 20. And then at the end of the diet, and then at the end of the post diet, is when we administered the psychological questionnaire again. So we were able to test all of those things essentially either 3 to 5 times was all of the variables. So that was really like the setup, and it was a lot, but it was great. And actually, so for anybody interested after this, the paper is open access. I did pay to have it open access so that everybody would be able to read it for free. So that's such a deterrent for people reading research. So if anybody is interested, they can read the entire study afterwards. If I don't bore you to death talking about it, so that was what we did. We started with 39 people, and we ended up with 23 or 24 individuals, which, of course, is a small scale study, but for most exercise science kind of nutrition intervention research, it's pretty standard. And it was mixed. It was males and females, and like we said, they had to be, resistance trained, and yeah, so that was pretty much the setup,
Okay.
and yeah, it was great.
Thanks for explaining that. So just as a quick
Yeah.
recap for the listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had two groups of participants, both of them
Hmm.
resistance trained, and these people were randomly assigned to one
Hmm.
of two types of diets. One was a more flexible diet with macros and an ebook explaining how to track them, and another
Hmm.
group got a slightly more rigid plan, which was a meal plan. But as you were saying at the
Mhm.
beginning, it was rigid, more rigid than macros, but still slightly more flexible than what you see in the fitness industry. Because my understanding is that you gave
Yeah.
them a couple of options to choose from for each type of food
Y
group.
yes, there's actually a sample meal plan in there too, on the paper. It's pretty basic. Again, it's basic. It's, a meal plan
Yeah.
and you gotta, it's not gonna be anything too elaborate. But I would say that, yeah, there were a few things you could switch out. So it wasn't like, yeah, have tilapia and asparagus for every meal.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
Just to
figure it out.
clarify.
Yeah, it was definitely, so yeah, we were truly just looking at, okay, let's look at tracking macros versus a meal plan, because at that point, again, taking us back to that time frame, um, you know, a lot of people were either saying, "Oh, IFYM is amazing," or it doesn't work, right? Like, there was those
Yeah.
two camps. So we were
Yeah.
like, "Well, let's test it."
Yeah, of
So,
course. So then the participants went through 10 weeks where they went through a dieting phase, 20%.
mhm,
Well, basically their caloric intake was 20% below either their RMR or their food log collected at the beginning. And then 10 weeks where they could eat ad libitum, which essentially means as much
mhm.
as they wanted to. And
Yes.
you tested body composition and the resting metabolic rates 5 times, correct? Throughout the
Yep.
study. Okay.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
And what did you find?
So essentially, there was really no differences between the groups during the dieting phase. All of the groups, lost body fat, which was exciting, and so there was really no differences there. And there were actually no other differences in the post diet period, except for one variable. We did see an increase in fat free mass in the flexible group.
I see.
So that was the only measurement, and we scoured everything. We looked back through the logs, like, there was no difference in time spent, statistically different time spent training, cardio, calories. Now, protein, there were, though, if you statistically there weren't, but if you do look at the averages, there were slight differences. And if you really, really look at it, and this is actually something that, because I had consulted with Eric Helms on this, like, what is going on? You know what I mean? And at the time, we really couldn't figure it out. And the only kind of working hypothesis, maybe that was a stretch, was, okay, well, maybe the rigid group was more stressed during that period so that they didn't, you know, have accumulate training gains as well. But again, kind of a stretch for the type of people that we're talking about. We're not talking about a physique athlete who just finished a 9-month prep, right? So it
Mhm.
was kind of like, all right, this is the only thing we have going. Maybe it could have been a fluke finding. Who knows? But then if you look at it a little bit, there are some minor differences amongst the just kind of averages of things, and essentially the reported calories of the rigid group didn't really match up with their weight gain afterwards. And
Mhm.
then whereas the flexible group, it made a lot more sense. So what Eric mentioned actually, like, last year, was, he did a write up in Mass on this, was potentially that the flexible dieting group who had been used to tracking macronutrients, had a better understanding of how much food they were actually eating afterwards. So they were able to actually categorize that more appropriately after, whereas the meal plan group had not been tracking. So understandably, they didn't have that skill built up over those previous 10 weeks. So their reporting likely wasn't as accurate. So again, is that the reason? I'm not sure. I look at it as, hey, we had one finding, but the real finding here is that it didn't matter, which actually was an exciting finding, to me, because it's like, hey, this really showcases that both approaches are going to work. And what I really, when I was, because I couldn't coach anybody in the group, of course, but I can ask questions. So I'm just asking the whole time. I'm just asking questions during I'm doing the body comp, and I'm like, okay, getting real intimate here. It's 5:30 in the morning. So how do you think you like your meal plan? So I'm just asking different stuff, and there were what I found was that people who had tracked macros previously did not like being in the meal plan group. That made sense. But people who had never really tracked their food absolutely loved being in the meal plan group because they're like, wow, I have ideas of what to eat. I can see portions better. I know what I should be eating for my body. And then likewise, people who had been tracking macros before, if they were in that group, pretty easy, pretty straightforward. If they hadn't tracked macros before and they were in that group, they were not doing too great. You know what I mean? They were very confused, very like kind of the normal stuff that we see with clients.
Hmm.
So I was like, all right. So again, it's not the method, it's where is this client in their journey?
Hmm.
And when we're talking, or where was that participant? And now as a coach, saying, okay, where is the client in the journey? What do they need right now? So I think that it's really useful to look at it in a lens in that sense to say, okay, what does my client actually need? And is one thing helping them or hurting them? And they could be using a different method, but I'm so stuck on my method.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarifying that. Now, I do want to ask you a question for clarification because I think we've been saying, hey, we found that both the meal plan and the macro-based diet worked. And then you also mentioned weight regain in the post-dieting phase. So just to
Mhm.
clarify for people who might not know, essentially what happened by the end of the fat loss phase, and then what happened after the 10-week ad libitum phase.
Yeah, so both groups gained, and but the both groups gained some fat mass back, which is understandable. But the flexible group regained some fat-free mass as well,
I
whereas there
see.
wasn't really a statistical difference,
Okay.
in
So
the other
they,
group. So
sorry, they lost the same amount of weight during the dieting phase, but then they regained some weight, and it seems like the flexible group gained more fat-free mass.
Yes. I wouldn't say they lost the same amount, but in terms of statistically significant, there were no differences there. So it was
Okay.
pretty on par. Like you would look at it and say, oh, there wasn't really a difference between the fat loss phase and then the weight, the post diet phase. I keep calling it the weight regain phase. We weren't trying for them to gain weight, but the post diet phase, sorry, I should correct myself. In the post diet phase, both of them gained, but then the flexible group also happened to gain some fat free mass. So
Mm.
it was again, I'm like, "Okay, cool," like, if it was because of the tracking or not, like, again, I was just more excited that, like, wow, we saw that, like, you can really do kind of both. And then within talking with people and then coaching more people over the years, I was like, "Okay, this has a lot more to do with their where the client is on their journey, 1, like we talked about, and then 2,
Mhm.
where is their mindset around this?" And because I started to see about, I don't know, 2018, I started to see all of the same issues that we had previously seen 5 years earlier with meal plans with macros. So I was
Mhm.
like, what's all this about? I'm seeing the same pathology that I was seeing 5 years ago. So that's when I started to recognize that it's not necessarily that flexible dieting is flexible. It's can be more flexible than other approaches in terms of food variety, but the mindset isn't necessarily as flexible, or it can be not flexible. So we could run into the same issues with rigid. You could track macros with very rigid restraints.
And I agree that your findings are really exciting because, in the end, well, not in the end, but what I'm hearing is that what you found was that physiologically there were no statistical differences between the groups, which means that whichever option you take, if you power through the one that you don't like, you're still going to see the same results as by taking the approach that you do like. But the problem is that, as we were saying at the beginning, people don't maintain those results if they power through the option that they don't like, because as you correctly said, or it was maybe written in the study, I'm not sure if you said it in this interview so far, but people see fat loss as a temporary torture, and then at the end they go back to doing exactly what they were doing before, because the option they chose to use to lose the fat was unsustainable in the long term.
Yeah, and that goes back to a mindset of again rigid mindset. I'm off or I'm on. This dichotomous thinking of I'm on a plan. Now I'm off the plan. I've crossed the finish line. I'm done. And to some degree, like, yes, if you've finished a dieting phase or you've hit your goal, you have your event or whatever it is, yes, it is done. But the goal should not just be these constant cycles of yo-yo dieting where you lose weight and then regain it. It's about why don't we take some of these tools that we used and we learned during this period and apply them afterwards. Like I haven't tracked a macro in I can't tell you how many years, right? Like honestly, since 2018. But I have been tracking my food most of my life in some capacity. Some of it very disordered, some of it, normal. But I have been tracking food for a very, very long time.
Hmm.
I don't need to write down 3 numbers to know what I'm eating, right? Now,
Yeah.
would I be able to be a little bit more consistent and dial things in? Yeah, for sure. But I know when I'm eating something, how much I'm eating because I've done this for a really long time. I still meal prep. I meal prep and portion my food out and I bring it places. Like that to me is not a weird thing. That's just a normal way of how I'm able to maintain a physique that I like with having some flexibility and some restraint, right? So
Hmm.
it's like these things of like it's just completely second nature, but people will be like, "Oh, I'm not on a plan right now. I'm just gonna kind of I don't know. I really don't know what people do when they don't meal prep. Like, I don't. I'm like, how do you eat? Like, what? Like, I know you don't just make fresh meals every day because that's completely like impossible. Like unless you just, I guess, are not working and you can do that. But most people are going to need to have some things planned. But a lot
Hmm.
of times they don't. Then they just, oh, I'll just get breakfast. I'll get a coffee, maybe like a pastry, and then I'll go out to lunch with my coworkers and I'll have some snacks at the office. Then I get home and I'm so hungry because I haven't really had anything substantial and now I'm gonna have dinner or order it in and then snack and stuff. And it's like we can avoid this and not being in a calorie deficit, but we can use those skills and behaviors that we've worked on during the diet. Now, so there's just so many different layers to it, and that was what was really cool about the study was that it wasn't. Yes, we answered the question, but it was much more than that for me.
I agree. I found it such an interesting study. I had never seen anything like that before, and I obviously don't know all of the research on this, but I found it pretty
There's not.
unique. You did mention in the study that it was the first of its kind, and I was like, yeah, I could
Yeah,
definitely see that. And I'm glad you
yeah,
touched
because
on.
everybody's like, why the hell would you do a 22-week study on this stuff?
And you were like, that's why.
My shit.
Well, I'm glad you touched on your own experience though, and the fact that you can not track and maintain a physique you like because you have so much experience tracking. And I do want to leave the listeners with some practical applications. And I think it's important to recognize that the tools, yes, you can choose from a variety of tools. You don't need to exclude any, but some are better for you. And it's not just based on your own preference, it's also based on the stage, the season of your life that you're in. So, as a practical application, my first question would be if somebody wanted to adopt this flexible restraint with dieting or with their
Mhm,
fitness journey in general as it
mhm.
pertains to nutrition, which criteria should they think about when they're choosing the option that might work better for them at some point or
Mhm.
other?
Yeah, I would just say start small by adding in flexibility, right? You're gonna have to challenge yourself with certain things, um, in order to learn. So let's just say a common example is eating out. Most people are going to want to eat out at some point in their week,
Hmm.
right? If that's some people, that's an everyday occurrence for them. So that might be something that we actually have to kind of rein in just based on, hey, like, it might be better to kind of to tighten this up a bit. But I would say at some point you can still make that work. I mean, I have clients who have all types of different lives and we make it work. So, but just for sake of argument, let's say it's eating out is the example. And somebody either when they eat out, they either don't eat because they don't know it's not on their plan, or they really struggle with the pick and then they want to overeat. This is a really great time to practice some restraint and say, okay, what would I normally be eating, right? Like, let's say it's a lunch. Like, what would I normally be eating? That's a quality meal. Okay, I'm gonna have a protein serving. I'm probably gonna have some type of vegetable. I'm gonna have a carb. Maybe I don't, depending on someone's plan. Obviously, if they're low carb or keto, but let's just say for a normal kind of balanced plan, okay, I'm not going to have a bunch of added fats on here because there's probably already some fats in the food. I'm going to ask for, this topping on the side. And then maybe I eat all the protein, I have the veggies, and then I'm just kind of mindful of my side and I maybe eat half of that portion. Something like that, that's moderating, right? That's saying, okay, what's going to be sort of similar to what I would normally eat? What's going to look like the same kind of breakdown, whether it is a meal plan or macros or calories? Okay, what's going to kind of look like this? And that's where you have to really start to develop some honesty with yourself. And it's not demonizing things. It's not saying, oh, that, you have to order a salad when you go out because burgers are bad for you. But it's about saying, okay, this is lunch. What is my normal lunchtime meal? What am I going to be eating later? Right? Maybe you do want to get the burger at lunch, but then that means that later it's going to need to be probably just higher protein and lower carbohydrates and fats. That's the moderating thing. That's the you can't have both things.
Hmm.
um, if you want to, again, if we're talking about maintaining a certain type of physique and health standard, so I would just say starting small, starting by making these choices, and you have to challenge yourself, and you're not going to get it right every time, right? It's not going to be something that is, you go to a restaurant for the first time where you've previously struggled and you nail it. It's going to be harder. And also knowing things that are maybe going to kind of set you off, right? So say you're going somewhere like a Mexican restaurant, right? And most people know, okay, when there's like the chips and salsa, or even just at a regular restaurant where there's like bread. Sometimes when people start things, it's like this is opening the floodgates, right? And it's like that maybe is that's where the restraint comes in to say, you know what, I'm not gonna have that this time, but I'm gonna order a meal that I really like. And if it is higher calorie, I'm gonna moderate my portions, or I'm gonna make some adjustments to the choices that I'm ordering and making. So it all really comes down to this moderation and choice. And it does become second nature at some point. It's not going to though in the beginning. It's just not. And I know that that's kind of that frustrating thing for people. You kind of have to go through those hard times to learn, but going in with that kind of a plan and that kind of a mindset is absolutely essential. And then just the more that you do it, the better it gets. And I just bring up eating out as an example because it's like one of the most common things people struggle with,
Hmm.
is a social eating aspect where they feel like they're out of control, but really you are fully in control of what you're ordering at all times. Like even if you're at a fit, like you, if you're at a restaurant ordering food, you are in control of what you are ordering and what you are not ordering. The only time that you're not, I would say, is if you're at a fixed menu, which is a really rare occurrence. But let's say you're at an event, a fixed menu, like you're at a wedding. Even then, you don't have any choice over what you're getting. You can still say, all right, what's on my plate? Okay, I'm going to have most of this, and I'm probably not going to have that, or I'm going to adjust here, right? Like those are the types of things that you have to say, okay, I want some of this. No, I don't want. I was at a fixed menu. It was just because it was like a large party the other day. And we were at this dinner. I haven't been in a fixed menu. I'm like, "Oh, what's all this?" So it came out. It was like, here's what's coming out. You get one choice of your like meat cut that you want, but everything else is like, this is coming out. So okay, I picked this choice. I had a little bit of that. I skipped that. I said, don't even bring it. I tried something, didn't like it, so I'm not going to waste anything on this. I'm going to fully eat my piece of meat. Like so. Even in that situation, it's like I'm still going to moderate, and I'm not thinking of that anymore because that's just how I live. But when I reflect on it, that is a lot of moderation, and that was a lot of choice to say, I don't want this, I do want that. Okay, I'm going to have just 2 bites of this. So I would say that no matter what, even if it is a fixed menu, which is pretty rare, um, you are in control of what you are eating and what you're not eating.
I feel like you're in my head. I literally recorded a podcast yesterday,
So
explaining,
funny.
well, helping. I wanted to help people manage social events, social eating with fat loss, and I literally said that. I said nobody's shoving food down your throat. You can always choose what and how much. If not what, then
Mhm,
how much you eat. And that's actually coming out
exactly.
before this interview with you, so it will be quite
That's
interesting for the listeners.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's such a powerful concept, and like you said, it's much more empowering for people when they think of it that way, because nobody is forcing you to. And I think what happens in social situations, and I know what happens in social situations is people get in their own heads. They think that everybody cares what they're eating, what they're doing. Your aunt made a comment, or this person said something, your coworker said some slick shit. They're not going home and thinking about you and what you're eating. I'll be honest. Like they maybe said something that you didn't want to hear, that you didn't like, and I'm sorry that they said that. But that really doesn't have any weight on you and your choices. That is one of those things. If somebody is saying that kind of stuff, you have to just be like, I gotta let this roll off my back. I'm not gonna let this deter me or change my choices because if I have solidified my goals and said, this is what I am working towards, whatever that goal is, but this is what I want to do, these are my goals, this is the person that I want to be, then you have to just say, okay, yeah, just kind of let it go. And those people, most people say comments without really thinking about. I mean, there's so many times where I've said things and I'm like, oh man, like I probably shouldn't have said that. Whoops. But I mean, people say things, and oftentimes we will internalize it so much, but that person is not really continuing to think about it in that sense. Like they're like, if your aunt made a comment about you, eating certain things, she's not like 2 days later, like, God, I really can't believe that she's, had a salad at dinner. Like, can you believe that? Like, no, no, that's not happening. But in the moment, it feels like, oh my gosh, everybody's judging me, everybody's looking at me. But I promise, like, if once you can get past that social pressure of what you're eating or not eating, it gets a lot better. I promise. Like, but I know it's hard. Like, it is very hard, and I would say it's even harder when you have been dieting and then now you're not in a deficit, and then people are like, "Oh, are you sure you're gonna eat that now? Like, can you eat that now?" And you're like, "Yeah, I, yep." Especially as a competitor, you know what I mean? Because that is just those are anything on extreme is going to be more noticeable, but even then people I I just try to live my life thinking, okay, people don't really mean that, they're not really weighing out the consequences of what they're saying, so I don't need to take it personally. And when clients are able to adopt that mindset, it gets so much easier for them to navigate social situations.
And the reason why you shouldn't worry about other people's comments is essentially what you've just said. People will make comments whether you do eat the brownie or whether you don't eat the brownie, and whether you choose the
Yeah,
salad or don't choose the salad. So if they're gonna
exactly.
make comments either way, that tells you that maybe their comments don't have the weight that you think they have.
Exactly. People just say stuff, and they don't and everybody takes things differently, like
Mhm.
there could be things that I would say to maybe somebody, not that, but other things, and I would think nothing of it, right? And then other people would be like, "Wait, what?" So it's like you just have to, as long as it's not this like malicious thing, and there are those situations too. There are people like, "Oh man, every time I see my so and so in my family, they say this. It's super mean to me." Okay, that obviously sounds a little intentional, but that is not going to deter you from your goals if you have solidified those and you say, this is what I want to be doing. So it's a tough, especially this time of year, like we're recording this in November, and
Mhm.
now like the end of the year is just kind of like holiday, like gathering, fun, family, like just everything is just happening
Yeah.
now. So it gets tough, but everybody can do it. I promise. Like, we can all get through it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you touched upon that because of the season. And just to recap for the listeners, then start small, be honest with yourself, and challenge yourself. And something that you haven't necessarily mentioned, listing it as a tip, but that was implied in what you said, is accept that it's a hard process. Being more flexible in with your cognitive restraint is not easy, and I think that's why options like flexible meal plans, or flexible, rigid meal plans, and very rigid diets are so popular because it feels short term, it feels so much easier to just follow a plan that's laid out very clearly. And I don't think people realize that the long term consequences are that it's simply not sustainable to continue doing something that never changes, because we are in flux, our lives are in flux, and what works for me today won't work for me in 6 months time. Would you agree with that?
100%. It always seems easier to be rigid. And that's why I try to really talk about this the way that I do, because people are getting this, they want to dive into something really aggressive and they think that this is, going to be the best case, but ultimately it's not in the long term. And like you said, when you're embarking on this type of a journey, recognizing that this is going to be hard and a challenge makes it easier for you to work up against that challenge, right? Just because the word flexible is in there does not mean that it's easy. Flexible does not mean easy. And I think that if people go into it thinking it's going to be easy, they're setting themselves up to fail. because your expectation is that this is going to be a cakewalk, and it's not. So anything that is going to actually teach you a skill is going to be hard on the front end, but you will develop those skills so that it will be easier on the back end a few years down the road.
And on the flip side, even when it's hard, I like to reframe it as anything that's worth doing is going to be challenging,
Yeah,
because that
of
challenge
course.
is what gives meaning to what we do in life. Just imagine doing something that comes super easy. How much does that mean to you? I usually take for granted what I can do super easily. It's second nature to me. I don't even think about it. If something is challenging for me, all of a sudden I'm thinking about it. And in a
Hmm.
way, that gives you a sense of purpose, doesn't it?
100%. That is purpose. Like, things should be a challenge. Things should be hard. And if you're not doing that, then I find that when people aren't putting themselves in those challenging situations voluntarily, that they create their own challenges that didn't even exist. And now they're living in this perpetual state of really getting nothing done, but feeling awful about it. So, yeah, challenging yourself and, like you said, reframing it is absolutely essential. And for more on that, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Great recommendation.
A
And
solid book plug.
well
But
done.
really, that should be like a required reading for everybody in the world.
What's the title again?
Man's Search for Meaning.
Okay,
Yeah,
bye.
it's Viktor Frankl.
Okay. Man's Search for
Oh,
Meaning.
if you haven't read it, you'll love it.
Yeah, I am gonna put it on my own reading list, and I'm gonna put it in the links in the show notes, along with links to your podcast, your coaching company's website, and the paper that we discussed today. And actually, we're coming to the end of the podcast because I want to be respectful of your time, but let the audience know everything that you want to plug. This is your time. Anything you want people to know about, tell them.
All right, but yes, definitely go read that book. It's phenomenal. It's a short read, but can't recommend it enough. So our website is teamlocofit.com. That is all of our coaching services and information. We did just release a app as well. So that is separate from our coaching. So it's the Redefined Healthy app that's also on the website. So we wanted to create two different things. We have our one-on-one coaching, and we also have the app. And then we have a podcast every week called the LoCoFit Show. I do occasionally put out things on YouTube and also post on Instagram. So LaurinConlin is my handle. So Laurin with an I. And then Team LoCoFit is our team Instagram handle. So yeah, all the things.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And again, dear listeners, if you want to link up with Laurin and with her other coaches in any way, just check out the links in the show notes. Laurin, thank you so much for coming on today. I think this conversation is so important. It's not sexy because we're not telling people this is what you need to do to get results, but it is
No,
what matters more than sexy, which is it's going to help get people the results that they want and help them maintain them in the long run, and not just have them for the sake of a before and after set of pictures and then look back on those pictures 6 months later thinking, oh my God, I really let myself go.
100%. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about this. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys who are listening enjoyed this as well.
Thank you very much for listening, listeners, and until next time. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview. And if you're interested in any of the resources we mentioned during the interview, please do check out the podcast notes. And if you want to let me know what you think of the podcast or of this interview, please do leave a review or send me an Instagram message or a message on Facebook or even an email at fit2transform@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. And until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.